Hello, everybody. This is Eric Quanstrom, and it's Friday, so that means it must be time for Sales Chats. With me, as always, is John Golden.
Morning, afternoon, evening, everyone joining us.
Absolutely, and we're really excited today because we've got Barbara Giamanco joining us from Atlanta, Georgia. Barb is a social selling leader, author, change agent, transformer, part of Generation Connected, a big thinker, passionate about experience. Hi, Barb.
Hey, Eric. Hey, John. How you guys doing? I get like the dynamic duo going on here today.
Absolutely. That's the idea. And we like to keep things fast-moving here at Sales Chats. So today's episode, we called it FOMO, fear of missing out, or fear of accountability.
Yep. Yeah, and we all know, as I think I tweeted earlier, we all know that everybody loves the idea of accountability as long as it applies to other people.
That's very true.
So one of the things to get the ball rolling is, Barb, you've been talking about social selling since as early as, 2006?
Yes.
Why haven't more salespeople adopted this tactic, and what's holding them back?
Yeah, great question. I think in the beginning, for me, it wasn't called social selling then, and I'm actually the second person to ever use the term and then publish it in a book. But my good friend Axel Schulze, actually over in Germany, wrote a blog post about it in right at the end of 2009, and that's when he called it social selling. But prior to that, I was seeing how the technology was impacting marketing and PR and communication, but I think a lot of people weren't really thinking along the lines of, well, it could shake up these other business areas and it could shake up sales as well. But I also think that there are a fair number of salespeople who kind of get caught in, they get in their little rut and they find things that work for them, and then they're kind of slow to want to try something else, especially if it's not clear to them how it makes revenue. What do you both think?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's a huge cultural change. If you think about it, even from the point of view of how do you as a sales manager enable your salespeople to have the time to leverage social tools? It's a different skill set. It's like if I tell you I'm going to a networking event down the road at the at the Chamber of Commerce this afternoon, as a sales manager, you're going, yeah, that's fantastic, go ahead. But if I tell you I'm going to spend the next 2 hours on LinkedIn and Twitter, you're going, well, make some calls.
Right. And the funny thing about those networking events, how come no one asks where's the ROI?
Right.
Because I still go to some in-person networking events, but not as many as I used to, because the only people in the room are other salespeople, not my customers, right?
That would be good for us at Pipeliner, but I take your point, Barb.
Yeah. So, like say for example, I'm trying to reach a lot of sales VPs and marketing leaders and so on, and often they're not going to as many of those events anymore because they don't want to be glommed onto by all the salespeople. So there's that. And also, but what I will say is, I get that between, say, 2006 and 2010, it was really early evangelism. But I'm still surprised that until about the last 18, 24 months, people were finally like waking up, like, oh, well, maybe we do need to think about how to integrate this into our sales process.
Well, it's interesting. We have a question for the Twitter chat portion of Sales Chats, and Q1, is asking, is sales traditionally a late majority population for adoption in general? I would definitely, characterize most of the sales population in that respect. I don't see them as early adopters, if you will, of new technologies per se.
No.
So I think you're probably on the bleeding edge, Barb.
Well, three things I'm really passionate about, Eric, and that is my love of people development. I love sales and marketing, and I love technology. And so, I'm fortunate that after retiring from Microsoft to start my own business, I could bring all those three things together. But I think the other problem with the adoption is that sales leadership is kind of holding some of that up. If you think about some of the sales leaders we have today, they're a little more experienced, right? And so when they came up through the ranks, we didn't have all this technology. So for them, the smile in and dial in, the dropping in the offices and whatever. Those were the things that really made them successful. And then the other thing that I think is, I think there's sometimes confusion. Like they see their kids on Facebook and they think that's what their salespeople are going to be doing, right? What do you think?
No, I think that's a perfect point. I think there is a certain association in the minds of a lot of people with social media and kind of fun, kind of frivolous, kind of waste of time. But I also think if we take it on the flip side, I also think that maybe we haven't done the greatest job ourselves in showing the ROI on it, because the ROI is kind of different, and I think that we've asked people to take a lot of things on faith. But what's your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, it's a great point. It's why I teamed up with my friend Jim Keenan at the end of 2012 to do an international blind survey. We had anecdotal evidence from our own customers, but of course you take that to market, that can seem a little self-serving, right? So we wanted to really find out, were salespeople able to demonstrate that they were not only closing more deals, but achieving quota more often than peers not using social. And for 3 years running, 2010, 11, and 12, and that's now been backed up in the last year or so by Forrester and Aberdeen, those salespeople using, like high majority, 73% roughly, those people who are integrating social into their, their sales process, they were actually outperforming their peers, and they were easily able to track deals, as many as 4 to 5 and 5+ deals using social, and then of course, no accident, LinkedIn was the #1 tool. But you raise a good point, John, because here's where I think we have this, and you and I have talked about this before, there's this great divide in terms of people talking about social selling. This does not stand apart from being a good salesperson. These are just a few more tools to put in the toolkit. You still have to figure out which things work for you, and it's just like, I'm not going to go on LinkedIn and make an immediate sale overnight. Neither am I going to go to a networking event, meet somebody once, and close a deal.
Right.
Not likely, especially if you're selling, a high ticket item.
Or so, one call close, for that matter, for the direct seller out there.
Well, as one of my friends, Tyler, said, unless you're selling a pack of gum, it's probably going to take more than one conversation. So I think there's been this notion of somehow social selling is this panacea, and it's kind of ridiculous. And people talk very high level about it. They don't actually get into the tactical work that it really takes to make this stuff happen. But it does work. I mean, I'm living proof. Even the customer I worked with this week, how did they find me last April? Alan, somebody heard me on a webinar. They follow me on Twitter. They hook up with me on LinkedIn. And next thing you know, I get a chance to propose. And they weren't quite ready, but they call me in November. They say, we're having this retreat in March of 2015. We'd love to hire you. Yeah. And that's kind of how it works, right?
So this is a great example, though, of a case study of social selling, which is actually an area where I feel like there hasn't been enough kind of case studies, anecdotal information, really kind of showing people, and frankly, this is one of the reasons we started this kind of omni-channel program, is to get more practical advice out into the world, right? Get it out into the Twitter stream, get it out in the Hangouts, talk about what's working. So actually, I think your example this week is probably a really good one to crack the egg on and maybe provide some of those details for people at home that may not be thinking along the ways that you are or were, right, in saying, okay, this is going to help me land new business, and here's how.
Sure. Well, and I think, so you both know, my philosophy is if you're going to be successful, and this is just sales in general, forget the social selling part, but you've got to start with a plan. What are you trying to accomplish? What's the buyer persona look like? Where are they likely to be? Are they all using the channels you might think of? So, for example, let's take LinkedIn for a minute. If you sell to government, LinkedIn's not as helpful for you. But there is a website that is LinkedIn basically for government called govloop.com. And so when you know who the audience is, then you can kind of figure out your strategy, then you can determine what are some of those tactics going to be. The other thing is, get some darn training. I mean, you're not going to be able to figure it out by clicking on buttons. You need a little bit of strategic help for how this is going to work and what you're going to measure and track and all that, and then, you know, it's that consistency. But I think what I'd like people to get from this is there's no one linear path. So I was published in the Harvard Business Review 2 summers ago, and people still ask me, did you have a PR agency? Who did that for you? And I said, no. One night in February, I get a tweet and a simultaneous email. They asked me to write on social selling.
Very good. Now,
how did that happen? I'm like, I knew I wanted to write for them. It was on a list, but it's very intimidating to think about HBR, and I had to know. So I said, well, how did you find me? Their sales VP heard me on a webinar. That started the whole thing. So unbeknownst to me, for 6 months, they were paying attention to what I did on Twitter, what I shared on LinkedIn. They were reading my newsletter, and they determined that I was somebody who they felt was credible, and they wanted to write for their publication. Now, that led to a seriously significant amount of new business. When people picked up that article and called me, and in every case there wasn't really even any negotiation. They just said, read your article in the Harvard Business Review, we need this, you know, when can you start? I mean, it does work, but people have to, they've got to think strategically, they've got to put in the effort, and again, you know, it's not like, that's like sales period, right? That's just sales period.
Yeah, I really like that example because not only is there's you know, all the social activity, but there's the element of hard work, right?
Yes.
And this kind of leads us into our question number 2, because I think again it gets back to do you feel like a lot of traditional sales managers, and especially sales managers who've grown up in, you know, in the past where sales was always considered a more kind of in-your-face aggressive, you know, like always be closing, you know, or prospecting, you know, buying.
Do I have your attention now?
Yeah, exactly, all of that. And what you're talking about, while it's still hard work and all that, it maybe to them appears a little more passive. You know, this idea of nurturing, of putting out stuff, of you know, building a brand. It all seems a little bit passive for that more traditional sales manager.
Sure. Well, you know, I think again it gets back to buyer behavior is completely different. I mean, when I think back to when I started back in sales 25 years ago, the buyer behavior is so different today than it was back then. Back then, buyers had to put up with pushy, aggressive salespeople because that was really their only avenue for getting information at that point, right? Mm-hmm. And personally, I think that would have been a sucky job to have been the buyer and having to deal with most of them. For me personally, this is the way I've always sold. I've always believed that you nurture and develop a relationship and you look for ways to help other people first, and now that's no different in social. But what is different is that now that buyers can go do a lot of early stage research and they can vet companies and salespeople they want to work with, they can bypass a lot of that, and they're also tired of putting up with the cheesy sales pitches and people who just want to try and come in and close them, so they can block them. And, you know, unless you demonstrate, the evidence is clear. Oh my gosh, it's books and research and surveys. They want people who help them solve business problems because they're not able to do it themselves. And unless you can demonstrate that you can do that, you're always going to be chasing your tail, quite frankly, in my opinion anyway. So, yeah, and again, you know, the sales managers, what worked for them back in the day was smiling and dialing, or, you know, I'll just go over to the business complex there and I'll go walk in every office and try to talk to somebody. I'm sorry. Does anyone really think that works?
So what advice would you have for, say, if I'm a salesperson and I really, you know, I've seen all this success of other people and I believe it can work, but I've got a sales manager who is maybe of the more traditional mindset.
Well, and even question 3 here, what role does fear play in sales management, right?
Yeah, that's true. So how do I, as a salesperson or even as a sales manager, how do I address that conflict?
Well, first of all, if you happen to be working for someone who's resistant, you know, a manager who's resistant to the technology, I think to the degree that you can, you play within whatever the guidelines you have within your organization, but find ways to still use social so that you can be the social proof. right? So that you can start to demonstrate that, hey, I was able to get in front of this opportunity more quickly and close it more quickly. Why? Because I spent time, early morning before the workday started, building relationships with people or whatever it might be. So I think there's that, and in fact, Coca Sexton over at LinkedIn, it was a funny post he wrote. I think he published it last week, and he was talking about when he was in a sales job, and he started getting wise to using social as part of it. He literally almost did get fired because he stopped making less calls, but he was getting better results. But then the manager was hounding him because he wasn't making enough calls. I think some of that's going to take time. If we can continue to show management that the investment of time leads to revenue, then we'll get quicker adoption. So that's one. But the second piece is, I think they don't know what they don't know. So as I work with customers, a lot of times the sales leadership, they're maybe not as savvy around the technology, and also I find they tend to be more nervous going online to represent themselves because they're very worried about making a misstep. So, I think those things kind of go hand in hand. So, their thinking is, well, what we did back in the day always worked. Why worry about this? And again, I come back to some of these folks have kids using Twitter or Facebook, and so they don't really understand how it applies to business. Just my thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, this is why we titled this program, fear of missing out versus kind of fear of accountability. Yeah. And it sounds like, defaulting to habit and inertia and what won't get you fired is kind of the rule as opposed to the exception.
Right.
So how do you go about when you're talking to people, consulting with people, especially, right into the sales manager's brains or the sales leadership's brains, how do you start to affect change?
Well, I think first is really you got to prove it to them. You really need to demonstrate that there is a return on investment and help, gently give them the education that, like, B2B sellers are not like your kids playing on Facebook. In fact, Facebook doesn't even play there. So usually the best place to start is really helping them get comfortable around LinkedIn. And the feedback I even got from the training I did this week is after the 2 days, people were like, I had no idea you could do these things. I had no idea that you could create these lead gen lists. I had no idea that this is how I could go about connecting with people. And so I think you do it gently, but you give them the proof and you let them know. And Eric, it's going to be like anything else. There's going to be a third who doesn't want to miss out on the new thing that's happening that's helping to make them successful. And top salespeople, they'll find a way, period.
Right.
And then you've got that middle crowd, and this applies to management too. You've got that middle crowd. They're going to kind of wait and see. But then all of a sudden they see more and more examples of people getting traction. And then finally you're going to have that final third who just say, yeah, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing until I'm forced kicking and screaming, right?
Well, at the end of the day, a lot of the sales mindset is very practical, right? We want to do what works, right? And so oftentimes if we see something work, even anecdotally, regardless of analytics and numbers and provability and the studies that you cited earlier, and I think ultimately if you see your cohorts, you see people that you're selling alongside or with having success, you're going to start to adopt and blend and pick up some of their traits and patterns.
Absolutely.
I agree. I think that's why, like you said, I think you have to, I think when you talk about accountability, I think, individual salespeople have to be accountable also for championing their own successes and, showing other people and showing upwards, maybe helping to assuage some of the fears of their sales managers by saying, look, this is what has worked for me and look at the impact it's having on my pipeline.
That's right. I think the other thing too is I make it a practice to show sales leaders what can be done in 15 minutes. So, because let's deal with the time thing head on. They assume it's going to be a major time suck, and it can be if you don't know what you're doing. But if you get yourself in a groove, now it's going to be a little more than 15 minutes if you're planning for a sales call, as an example. You might spend a little extra time. But in general, doing some of the the inbound marketing things that we're trying to do. In 15 minutes, you can share a piece of relevant content. You might answer a question in a group. You can invite some people to connect. You know, you can do a couple of things each day that help to increase that visibility and give you a chance to demonstrate your credibility and capability. And once sales leaders start to see that, oh, really? Just 15 minutes? Then that starts to make them feel a little more comfortable about this whole thing. And then the other piece is there is a ton of noise, and it does lead sales leaders to sometimes think that all you need to do is sit at your desk and be on social, which we all know is not true.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So once they understand that this is just, you know, a few other tools that you can use and pull out of your toolkit to augment the things that already are working, then you start to get traction. And in my case, it doesn't hurt that I've been in sales and sales leadership roles my entire career, so I have a little credibility with them.
Yeah, we have a quick question from the.
Uh-oh. All right, so I think I know what the question is, so I'm going to jump in here and do a little tap dancing. I think these guys got froze on the Hangout, but I think the question relates to best practices for using LinkedIn to make the connections that you want. Yeah, that's a great question. Some of the things that I like to do is, you know, obviously when I get connected with people, I like to see who they're connected with, and I find that's a really great way to then you know, get connected to them. But to be honest with you, one of my best practices as far as that goes is kind of old school. I like to, you know, if there's somebody that I want to get connected with, more often than not, I'm going to come to the person who's got that relationship already and see if they can't help me with an introduction. But the other way to make great connections is by doing things like publishing a post on LinkedIn, because that encourages people to comment and share. And when I've, you know, had my posts up there, I've had sales leaders visit and make comments on some of my posts, and we haven't been connected yet. But the moment that they comment and then I get a chance to engage with them a little bit, then that kind of opens the door for us to get connected. And then the other thing is, you know, there's a great opportunity to build relationships with people in groups and answering questions and whatnot. So how's that for tap dancing, guys?
Yeah, that was excellent, because I wasn't sure whether you had gone or we had gone. So I was also talking, but it sounds like I was talking to myself, which you know, sometimes can be interesting conversations and sometimes can be really boring. So
well, I saw the question in the chat, so I thought that was probably the one you were going to tee up.
So here's one of the for our last question of the day. Here's something that I know a lot of salespeople struggle with, and to be honest, you know, I've struggled with myself in the early days of trying to adopt a social selling toolkit. Is that how to elegantly transition during a process of nurturing into a more direct sales engagement? It's like, how do you move that conversation into this? It's an interesting conversation, we're sharing, we're connected, all of that. Is moving that over into something more, a more direct sales engagement, like really starting to move it into the sales, the more traditional sales realm?
Yeah, you know, it's a good question, because I'm always asked, okay, we talk about, you know, engaging, well, when's the right time to engage? And what the question really is when is the right time for me to make a sales pitch? So don't make a pitch, but it's a fair question, because we are doing these things to try and get an opportunity to secure a meeting. And so I like to watch for triggers. If they're engaging or commenting on my posts, if they've turned around and shared something that I've shared, and we've started to build up a little bit of a relationship, then the next thing I might do is share a white paper or some industry report, but with them individually through the platform. And then I think there just comes a moment when, you know, if you're already kind of having a conversation, you know, you might even say, I'm just curious. I talked to a lot of leaders in your position. What kinds of business challenges are you faced with this year? And then if you've developed enough of a relationship, that's just an example, you're going to say, well, if you ever have 15 minutes, love to chat with you about that. I might be able to connect you with some peers. So I think everybody will find their own groove, but you have to kind of watch for triggers. But of course, the ideal is when you've developed enough of a relationship that they say, yeah, I'd like to get on the phone and talk to you a little bit more about this. Now
Right.
you know that's the right time.
Or I can see in your profile that you know about this, and I can see by what you're sharing, you're a domain expert in, like in our case, CRM, right? And that would be kind of like a natural thing for somebody who's engaged to bring up.
That's right. Now also there's some other cool ways that you can do it, but you got to do it in a way that's really authentic. But I podcast. So I invite people to be interviewed, and I blog, so I invite people to give me a quote or two. So again, it's taking the spirit of what can I do for them first, and then naturally, really, I've invited people to be part of my podcast. You don't think they want to have a conversation a little bit more with me later after what we do? Of course. So be creative. Find other ways to help them. My gosh, you could set up a peer-to-peer networking that you facilitated, and you bring them together with their peers. Again, you're never selling a darn thing, but you're helping them first. Once you do those sorts of things, I think the rest takes care of itself. The ask becomes pretty easy about, what do you think about sitting down and talking about whether or not there's an opportunity for us to work together? That's kind of how it works for me. But what about the two of you? What do you think?
Well, no, I agree with you, and I think it's just the important part. And I think this, again, is if you want to get it adopted and you want your organization to buy into it, is that you are looking for those triggers, and you're not just getting into a continuous loop. It's like, but then again, if you look at it, it's like in traditional, even face-to-face sales. Like if you're meeting the same prospect for lunch every month for 6 months, and you haven't moved the sales process forward at all, it's the same as an endless loop of engagement online if you're not actually moving anything forward.
That's a good point. But there are other things you can do too. Like, so for example, in addition on LinkedIn, I love using Inside View because it's a very robust business intelligence tool. I may come across a piece of information that is competitive information, and my prospect would probably really benefit from knowing. And so, I say something like, well, I just read this in the news, and I'm wondering, have you seen this yet? And and if the answer is no, well, obviously, I wanted to share this with you, and if you want to talk about it, let's get on the phone and have a conversation. But again, I think one of the problems, guys, is that people are too impatient.
Yeah.
They're trying to use the social channels as a shortcut, and there are no shortcuts. It still takes strategic thinking. It still takes kind of planning out your approach. It takes a little bit of time, but in my case, in the case of many, many other sellers, you can get traction fairly quickly, but anybody who thinks that you don't put in some work to make it successful for you is just unfortunately kidding themselves.
Well, I think one of the other things to add on top of that list, the cherry on the sundae, is really, it's upstairs. It's
Yes.
inner game where you have to remove that expectation of anything, really, because the buyer is going to ultimately decide on their own, independently of you, what they see value in and what their time frames look like. Now, there's ways that you can frame and contextualize the interaction to create a little bit more urgency or to create a little bit more focus on what it is you're bringing to the table. But again, I don't see where in a social selling relationship you have any sort of expectation, because that will crater things quicker than just about anything else.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And there are people who have this expectation that, I can just connect with someone on LinkedIn and bam, I'm going to go right to the sales pitch. Well, good luck with that, because now you've shot yourself in the foot, and you are not going to have any chance at this. So it's kind of a delicate balance. But I think that, especially if you're a little more experienced in selling, you sort of know at a gut level what's being surfaced that says, yeah, I think there's an opportunity here. But, I just can't say it enough. The more you can find a way to give first, and I mean valuable relevant business information that's going to help your prospect in some way, shape, or form, whether it's you make a connection for them or, you know, host a webinar and bring them on as an expert. You know, I think what it comes down to is you just have to think a little more creatively and a little more strategically, because the irony is when you do things like that, it doesn't actually draw out the sales cycle, it shrinks the gap.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It shrinks the gap because you're saying, I'm not like every other salesperson out there. And they see that, and that's what buyers, I think, are looking for.
All right, well, this has been fantastic, Barb. We're bumping up against the end of this, so we always end up with what Eric likes to call his...
The Sales Chat Supercharge Sales Tip
So
from our experts.
Yeah, so the one for you is name one of your daily secrets to getting in the right mindset for success.
Pick a kick-butt piece of music, one of my favorite to listen to. One of my favorites is Baby I'm a Star from Prince.
Excellent.
Okay.
And actually, funny you should mention that. I mean, I remember back in the day, one of the things that they used to do on some of the sales floors was before they'd start hitting the phones at 8 o'clock. You know, it's 7 until 8. They just crank up the music and get everybody, you know, in the groove before.
Hard to have a bad day with good music.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, I really, some piece of music, I'm usually a pretty positive, fired up person anyway. There's that, and then usually I'll meditate for like 10 minutes, just 10 minutes to kind of get my head and, you know, and think to myself, how can I help people today? And then I just go out and make it a great day. So there you go.
That is fantastic. Well, once again, thanks for coming on, Barb. We really appreciate having you. This was valuable.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, and
chock full of tips episode.
Exactly, and the Twitter feed was fired up too. So again,
blowing up out there.
Thanks, Barb. This has been great as always. Look forward to chatting again soon.
All right.
That's great, John, Eric. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Bye now.